In the beginning, there was darkness. And in that darkness, something terrible stirred. A father so consumed by paranoia that he devoured his own children the moment they drew breath. But one child would survive. One child would grow to shake the very foundations of heaven and earth, to cast down titans and claim a throne that would make him the most powerful being in all creation. This is the story of Zeus, king of the gods, master of the thunderbolt, and perhaps the most dangerous tyrant Olympus has ever known. Before we launch ourselves into the world of Zeus, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Whether you're tuning in at midnight, under a canopy of stars, or at dawn as the first light touches your window, it's lovely to have you here. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations through Greek mythology, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the Pantheon Chronicles grow, and it means more curious souls like you can drift off with minds full of gentle marvel. Picture, if you will, a time before time. Before the sun had a name, before the mountains knew their heights, before humanity took its first trembling steps upon the earth. In this primordial darkness, the ancient Greeks believed there existed beings of such immense power that their very thoughts could reshape reality itself. We call them the Olympians now, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and the rest. But to truly understand these entities, we must first understand that they were never meant to be heroes. They were forces of nature, given consciousness, passions made manifest, and in their stories we find some of the most brutal, complex, and fascinating tales ever told. Tonight, we're going to explore the rise and reign of the most powerful among them, Zeus, the thunderer, the cloud gatherer, the king of the gods. But this isn't the sanitized version you might remember from childhood stories. This is the Zeus of the ancient sources, a being of terrible beauty and terrifying power, whose path to the throne was paved with patricide, whose reign was built on fear, and whose legacy is written in lightning across the sky. We'll follow his journey from a hidden infant in a Cretan cave to the undisputed ruler of Olympus. We'll witness the war that ended an age, the betrayals that shaped a pantheon, and the countless acts of divine wrath that kept both gods and mortals in line. And perhaps most importantly, we'll discover why the ancient Greeks, who knew a thing or two about tyrants, chose to make their supreme deity one of the most complex and morally ambiguous figures in all of mythology. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a story that begins with infanticide and ends with the establishment of an eternal divine dictatorship. This is the tale of Zeus, not as a benevolent father figure, but as the ultimate example of power corrupting absolutely. Our story begins not with Zeus, but with his father, Kronos, the titan who ruled the cosmos before the gods were even a whisper in the void. Kronos had seized power in the most violent way imaginable, by castrating his own father, Uranus, with a sickle forged from the hardest adamant. The blood that fell from that wound gave birth to the Furies, to the giants, to creatures so terrible that even the gods would learn to fear them. But power, especially power taken through violence, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. When Kronos claimed the throne of the universe, he received a prophecy that would haunt him for the rest of his immortal existence. One of his children would rise up and overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father before him. Most beings might have simply chosen not to have children, but Kronos was a titan, and titans were creatures of appetite and inevitability. He married his sister Rhea, as was the custom among these primordial beings, and when she bore him children, he made a choice that would echo through eternity. He devoured them. Picture the scene. Rhea, having labored to bring forth new life, watches in horror as her husband takes the newborn child and swallows it whole. Not killing, swallowing. The children weren't dead. They were trapped within the stomach of their father, conscious and aware, waiting in the darkness for a salvation that might never come. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth, swallowed before she could even cry. Then Demeter, who would one day make the earth bloom with grain and flowers, gone in an instant. Hera, who would become the queen of the gods, disappeared down her father's throat. Hades, future lord of the underworld, suffered the same fate. And finally Poseidon, who would one day rule the seas, joined his siblings in their father's belly. 5 children, 5 future gods, all of them condemned to an existence of unimaginable horror because their father's paranoia had consumed him as completely as he had consumed them. But Rhea, despite her grief, was not powerless. She was a titaness, daughter of Gaia, the Earth Mother herself, and she carried within her the patience and cunning of the earth itself. When she felt the 6th child stirring within her womb, she knew this would be her last chance. This child, this Zeus, would either save his siblings or join them in their living tomb. The night of Zeus's birth, Rhea fled to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Dicte, where the shadows were deep and the echoes of the world above could not penetrate. There, in the darkness, she gave birth to the child who would reshape the cosmos. But birth was only the beginning of her deception. In the depths of the Dictean cave, surrounded by the ancient power of Crete's primordial gods, Zeus drew his first breath. But even that first breath had to be muffled, for Kronos' ears were keen, and the cry of a divine infant could travel across dimensions. Rhea's plan was as audacious as it was simple. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and returned to Kronos, presenting it as their newest child. And Kronos, so consumed by fear and the mechanical nature of his infanticide, swallowed the stone without question. The deception was complete, but now came the truly dangerous part. Zeus had to be raised in secret, hidden from the most powerful being in the universe. The cave became his nursery, but he was not raised by his mother. That would have been too risky. Instead, a group of warrior priests called the Curetes surrounded the cave, and whenever the infant Zeus cried, they would clash their shields and spears together, creating such a tremendous din that any sound from within the cave was completely masked. Day and night they kept their vigil, turning the child's cries into the rhythm of war. But who would nurse a god? Who would dare to nourish the future king of Olympus? The task fell to a goat named Amalthea, though some sources say she was a nymph who took the form of a goat. Either way, she became Zeus's foster mother, and her milk carried within it the power to nourish divinity itself. In some versions of the tale, it was her horn that would later become the cornucopia, the horn of plenty that would forever after provide abundance to those who possessed it. As Zeus grew in that hidden cave, he was watched over by beings who understood the weight of what they were protecting. The cave itself seemed to participate in his concealment. Bees brought him honey, eagles brought him ambrosia, and the very walls of the cave seemed to whisper secrets of power and leadership into his developing mind. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of Zeus's hidden childhood was what it taught him about power. He learned that true strength sometimes requires patience, that the most devastating attacks come from the shadows, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through direct confrontation, but through careful planning and perfect timing. Years passed, and Zeus grew from infant to child to young god, all while his father believed him to be nothing more than a digested stone. But divine childhood cannot last forever, and as Zeus approached maturity, the time for hiding was coming to an end. The prophecy that had driven Kronos to such terrible acts was about to fulfill itself, and the cosmos was about to witness a war that would make the castration of Uranus seem like a minor disagreement. When Zeus finally emerged from his cave, he was no longer the helpless infant his father had tried to destroy. He was a young god, radiating power and possessed of a cunning that had been honed by years of secret planning. But he faced a seemingly impossible task. How do you overthrow a being who has swallowed time itself, who commands the very forces of the cosmos? The answer came from an unexpected source. Zeus sought out Metis, the titaness of wisdom and cunning, whose very name meant craft or skill. If anyone could devise a plan to defeat Kronos, it would be her. And Metis, perhaps recognizing the necessity of change, perhaps simply drawn to the audacity of the young god, agreed to help. The plan they devised was both elegant and horrifying. Metis would create a potion, part poison, part emetic, that would force Kronos to vomit up everything he had swallowed. But getting the potion to Kronos would require Zeus to do something that went against every instinct of self-preservation. He would have to approach his father directly. Disguising himself as a cupbearer, Zeus infiltrated Kronos' palace. Think of the nerve required for this deception. Walking into the presence of the being who had tried to devour you, whose very existence was built on the fear of your birth, and offering him a drink with a smile. But Zeus had learned patience in his cave, and he played his role perfectly. The moment came, as it always does in these stories, when Kronos was distracted by the business of ruling the cosmos. Zeus stepped forward, offering a cup of wine mixed with Metis' potion. Kronos, perhaps recognizing something familiar in the young cupbearer's face, but unable to place what it was, drank deeply. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Kronos' immortal body convulsed, and from his throat came not just the stone that had been swallowed in Zeus's place, but all of Zeus's siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. They emerged fully grown, divine, and absolutely furious. Imagine the scene. 5 gods, born into the world for the second time, their first taste of true freedom, flavored with the bile of their father's stomach. They had been conscious through it all, aware of their imprisonment, and now they stood before the being who had stolen their childhoods and condemned them to darkness. But Zeus wasn't finished. In that moment of Kronos' weakness, he also freed the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed giants who had been imprisoned even longer than his siblings. These beings, masters of forge and warfare, had been locked away by Kronos out of fear of their power. Now they were free, and they were eager to repay the debt of their liberation. The Cyclopes, in gratitude, forged weapons that would become the symbols of the gods' power. To Zeus they gave the thunderbolt, a weapon of such devastating force that it could shatter mountains and split the sky. To Poseidon they gave the trident, capable of stirring the seas and splitting the earth. To Hades they gave the helmet of invisibility, which would allow him to move unseen through any realm. And so, in a single, perfectly executed moment, Zeus had not only freed his siblings, but had also secured the weapons they would need for the war that was now inevitable. Kronos, the devourer of children, was about to discover that some prophecies cannot be escaped, no matter how much violence you're willing to commit to avoid them. What followed was not a battle. It was a war that lasted 10 years and threatened to tear the very fabric of reality apart. The Titanomachy, as it came to be known, was a conflict between the old order and the new, between the Titans who had ruled since the beginning of time and the gods who would claim dominion over the future. The battle lines were drawn across the cosmos itself. The Titans, led by Kronos, claimed Mount Othrys as their stronghold, while Zeus and his siblings established their base on Mount Olympus. Between these two peaks, the fate of existence itself would be decided. This wasn't warfare as mortals understand it. When gods fight, reality itself becomes a weapon. Zeus hurled thunderbolts that split the sky and caused the mountains to tremble. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, causing earthquakes that swallowed entire landscapes. The Titans retaliated with forces equally devastating. Atlas used his strength to hurl entire mountain ranges, while Hyperion turned the sun itself into a weapon, scorching the earth with solar fire. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Titanomachy was its scale. This wasn't a conflict that could be contained to a single realm. The war raged across the heavens, through the depths of the earth, and into the primordial waters that surrounded the world. The sound of battle could be heard in dimensions that mortals couldn't even perceive, and the very concept of time became fluid as past, present, and future all seemed to exist simultaneously in the chaos. The mortals who witnessed this war, for humanity existed even then, though they were primitive and few, could only watch in terror as the sky burned and the earth cracked. Some sources suggest that this war was the origin of many of the world's most dramatic geological features: the Grand Canyon, the Himalayas, the deep ocean trenches, all scars left by divine conflict. For 9 years the war raged without a clear victor. The Titans were ancient and powerful, their mastery of cosmic forces refined over eons. But the gods were younger, more adaptable, and they had allies that the Titans had foolishly imprisoned. The Cyclopes provided not just weapons, but also strategy, their understanding of cosmic engineering proving invaluable in the war effort. But it was the Hecatonchires who truly turned the tide. These 100-handed giants could hurl boulders the size of mountains with each of their 100 arms simultaneously. When they entered the battle, the very nature of the conflict changed. Suddenly, the Titans found themselves facing not just the gods, but a bombardment of stone and metal that came from every direction at once. The final battle took place on the plains between Olympus and Othrys, where the accumulated power of 10 years of divine warfare finally reached its crescendo. Zeus, wielding his thunderbolt like a spear of pure cosmic energy, struck Kronos down. The blow didn't kill the Titan. Gods cannot truly die, but it shattered his power and sent him tumbling into the depths of Tartarus, the prison that lies beneath even the underworld. One by one, the other Titans fell. Some were banished to Tartarus alongside Kronos. Others were assigned eternal punishments that would serve as warnings to any who might challenge the new order. Atlas, who had led the Titans' military efforts, was condemned to hold up the heavens for all eternity, a punishment that was both practical and symbolic, for it meant that the barrier between earth and sky would never again be breached by those who would challenge Zeus's authority. When the dust settled and the cosmos finally knew peace, a new age had begun. The gods had won, but victory came at a cost that would shape their rule for millennia to come. They had learned that power must be maintained through fear, that mercy could be seen as weakness, and that the price of authority was eternal vigilance against those who would challenge it. With the Titans defeated and banished to Tartarus, the gods faced a new challenge: how to divide the cosmos among themselves. This wasn't simply a matter of drawing borders on a map. The universe itself had to be partitioned, and the very forces of nature had to be assigned to different divine authorities. The solution came in the form of lots, a drawing that would determine who ruled what. But this was no ordinary casting of lots. These were divine lots, imbued with the power of fate itself, and their outcome would determine the structure of reality for all time. Zeus, as the leader of the rebellion and the one who had struck the final blow against Kronos, claimed the right to oversee the drawing. In his hands he held 3 lots, one for the heavens, one for the seas, and one for the underworld. The earth itself would remain common to all 3 brothers, though Zeus's authority as king of the gods would give him precedence even there. The first lot was drawn by Zeus himself. When he opened it, he found that he had claimed dominion over the heavens, the sky, the weather, the very air that mortals breathed. This was appropriate, for his weapon was the thunderbolt, and his power was most naturally expressed through storm and lightning. From his throne atop Mount Olympus, he would rule over all the gods and maintain order in the cosmos. Poseidon drew the second lot, and when he opened it, he found that the seas were his domain. This vast realm included not just the oceans, but all water, rivers, lakes, springs, and even the underground waters that flowed through the deepest caverns. His trident would allow him to control these waters, to raise storms that could sink entire fleets, or to calm the waves with a gesture. The third lot fell to Hades, the eldest of the 3 brothers, and when he opened it, he found that he had become lord of the underworld. This realm of the dead was vast and terrible, populated by the souls of mortals who had passed beyond the veil of death. It was, in many ways, the most important realm of all, for every living being would eventually find themselves subject to Hades's authority. But the division went deeper than just these 3 primary realms. The other gods and goddesses each claimed their own spheres of influence. Hera, as Zeus's wife and queen, would oversee marriage and family life. Demeter would rule over the harvest and the fertility of the earth. Athena would govern wisdom and warfare. Aphrodite would control love and beauty. Apollo would oversee music, prophecy, and the sun. Artemis would rule the hunt and the moon. Ares would command the brutal aspects of war. Hephaestus would master the forge and all craftsmanship. Hermes would serve as messenger and guide between the realms. Each assignment was more than just a title. It was a fundamental restructuring of how the universe operated. Where once the Titans had ruled through raw power and ancient authority, the gods would rule through specialized expertise and careful balance. Each god would be supreme in their domain, but Zeus would maintain ultimate authority over the entire system. This division also established the hierarchical structure that would define Olympus for millennia. Zeus was not just first among equals. He was the absolute ruler, the final arbiter of all disputes, and the only being with the power to overrule the decisions of other gods. This wasn't democracy. It was divine monarchy, and Zeus wielded his authority with all the complexity and contradiction that absolute power brings. The establishment of these divine domains also meant that the gods would have to learn to work together in ways that the Titans never had. The success of the harvest required cooperation between Demeter and Zeus. The safety of sailors required coordination between Poseidon and Athena. The fate of heroes required agreements between multiple gods, each with their own interests and agendas. But perhaps most importantly, the division of the cosmos established the principle that would govern divine politics for all time. Power shared is power multiplied, but power shared is also power that must be constantly defended, negotiated, and reinforced through alliance, intimidation, and the occasional demonstration of divine wrath. With the cosmos divided and the gods settled into their realms, Zeus faced his greatest challenge yet, establishing a system of law that would govern not just mortals, but the gods themselves. This was unprecedented. The Titans had ruled through might and ancient custom, but Zeus understood that lasting power required more than just strength. It required legitimacy, structure, and the consent of the governed, even if that consent was sometimes extracted through fear. The first and most fundamental law was the principle of divine hierarchy. Zeus's word was final, not just because he was the strongest god, but because he was the king of the gods, chosen by fate and confirmed by victory. This wasn't mere tyranny, it was cosmic necessity. The universe required order, and order required authority, and authority required a single, unquestioned source of ultimate power. But Zeus was wise enough to understand that even absolute power must be exercised with some restraint. He established the concept of divine domains, which meant that each god had absolute authority within their sphere of influence. Poseidon could not be overruled in matters of the sea, Hades could not be challenged in matters of the dead, and Demeter could not be contradicted in matters of the harvest. This gave the other gods a stake in the system, and made them partners in divine governance rather than merely subjects. The second great law was the principle of divine justice. Zeus claimed the title of Zeus the Just, not because he was always fair, but because he was the ultimate arbiter of what constituted justice in the first place. This was a revolutionary concept. Justice was no longer simply a matter of might making right, but was instead defined by divine will and cosmic order. To enforce this justice, Zeus established the Fates, three sisters who would weave the destiny of every living being. But here's where Zeus's political genius becomes apparent. He made the Fates subservient to his will, but he also made them appear independent. This allowed him to enforce his decisions while claiming that they were simply the inevitable working of destiny. "It is fated" became the ultimate justification for divine action. The third law was perhaps the most important, the separation between gods and mortals. While the Titans had often interacted directly with early humans, sometimes even breeding with them, Zeus established strict boundaries. Gods could intervene in mortal affairs, but only according to certain rules, and always with the understanding that mortals were fundamentally different from and inferior to divine beings. This separation served multiple purposes. It protected mortals from the full force of divine power, which could destroy them simply through proximity. It also protected the gods from the contamination of mortal concerns, which could diminish their divine nature. Most importantly, it established the gods as objects of worship rather than equals, which was essential for maintaining their authority. Zeus also established the concept of divine punishment, which would serve as the foundation for both divine and mortal justice systems. The punishments he devised were not just retribution, they were examples, designed to teach lessons that would prevent future transgressions. Prometheus, who stole fire for humanity, was chained to a rock where an eagle would devour his liver each day, only for it to regenerate each night. This wasn't just punishment for theft. It was a demonstration of what happened to those who challenged divine authority. Similarly, Sisyphus, who had repeatedly outsmarted the gods, was condemned to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time he neared the summit. This punishment was specifically designed to match his crime. He had used cleverness to avoid divine justice, so his punishment was an eternal task that made cleverness meaningless. But perhaps Zeus's most important innovation was the establishment of oaths sworn by the river Styx. These oaths were binding even on the gods themselves, and breaking them carried terrible consequences. This created a system of divine accountability that prevented the gods from acting entirely without restraint, while simultaneously reinforcing Zeus's authority as the one who could administer the oaths and enforce their consequences. The establishment of divine law also meant the creation of divine bureaucracy. Zeus couldn't personally oversee every aspect of cosmic governance, so he appointed minor gods and spirits to handle specific duties. The Muses would inspire mortals to great artistic achievements. The Graces would ensure that beauty and charm continued to exist in the world. The seasons would maintain the natural cycles that governed mortal life. This system of divine law would prove remarkably durable, surviving for millennia and influencing human concepts of justice, authority, and cosmic order long after the temples to Zeus had crumbled to dust. Just as Zeus might have thought his authority was finally secure, the earth itself rose up to challenge him. Gaia, the primordial Earth Mother, had watched the rise and fall of the Titans with divine patience. But when she saw her children, the Titans, imprisoned in Tartarus, her maternal rage finally overcame her ancient wisdom. From her union with Tartarus, the deepest and most primal realm of punishment, Gaia gave birth to the giants, beings that were neither fully divine nor fully mortal, but something far more dangerous than either. These were creatures designed specifically to challenge the gods, each one possessing powers that could match or exceed those of the Olympians. The giants were not merely large humans, as their name might suggest. They were embodiments of primal forces, beings whose very existence was an affront to the ordered cosmos Zeus had established. Some had serpents for legs, others breathed fire, and still others could control the very elements themselves. Each giant was a walking catastrophe, a force of nature given consciousness and intent. The most formidable among them was Alcyoneus, whose strength was literally inexhaustible as long as he remained in contact with his mother, the earth. There was Porphyrion, whose power rivaled that of Zeus himself, and whose ambition was to claim both the throne of Olympus and the bed of Hera. Ephialtes and Otus, the twin giants who had once tried to storm heaven itself by stacking mountains on top of each other. And perhaps most terrifying of all, Typhoeus, though some sources place him in a separate conflict, a creature so vast and terrible that when he stirred, the very foundations of reality trembled. But Gaia had learned from the Titans' defeat. She knew that raw power alone would not be enough to overthrow Zeus, so she sought out a prophecy of her own, one that revealed the gods' greatest weakness. They could not defeat the giants without the help of mortals. This seemed absurd. How could mortals, who were barely more than insects compared to divine beings, be necessary for victory over the giants? The answer lay in the nature of the giants themselves. These beings existed in a space between divine and mortal, and defeating them required weapons that could bridge that gap. Only arrows fired by mortal hands could deliver the final blow that would send a giant to its death. The gods could wound them, could weaken them, could even seem to defeat them, but the killing stroke had to come from mortality itself. This revelation terrified the gods in ways that the Titanomachy never had. During the war with the Titans, they had at least been fighting beings like themselves, immortal, powerful, but ultimately comprehensible. The giants represented something far more alien and threatening. The possibility that the cosmic order they had established could be overthrown by forces that operated according to different rules entirely. The Gigantomachy, as the war against the giants came to be known, was fought across the earth itself. Unlike the Titanomachy, which had been primarily a conflict between the heavens, this war brought divine combat down to the mortal realm. Every battlefield became a place where the very laws of reality were tested and sometimes broken. Zeus, recognizing the threat, immediately sought out mortal allies. But this presented its own problems. How do you convince mortals to fight against beings who could destroy them with a glance? How do you arm them with weapons capable of harming creatures that shrugged off divine attacks? The answer came in the form of Heracles, the greatest of heroes, whose mortal nature was combined with divine strength inherited from Zeus himself. Heracles became the crucial weapon in the war against the giants, his arrows capable of delivering the killing blows that the gods themselves could not achieve. But even with Heracles' help, the war was far from easy. The giants had advantages that the Titans never possessed. They could not be permanently banished to Tartarus, for their connection to the earth meant they could potentially return. They could not be reasoned with, for their entire existence was predicated on the destruction of the current cosmic order. And they could not be ignored, for their very presence poisoned the earth and made normal life impossible. The final battle of the Gigantomachy took place on the plains of Phlegra, where the earth itself seemed to burn with primal fire. Here, gods and mortals fought side by side in a conflict that would determine whether the ordered cosmos would survive or whether chaos would reclaim the universe. When the dust settled and the last giant fell, Zeus had learned a lesson that would shape his rule for millennia to come. Even absolute power requires allies, and sometimes those allies must be drawn from the most unexpected sources. The victory over the giants established not just divine supremacy, but also the principle that gods and mortals were bound together in ways that neither could entirely control. Even after the defeat of the giants, Zeus's trials were not over. Deep beneath the earth, in the volcanic depths where fire and stone merged into something more terrible than either, something stirred. This was Typhoeus, or Typhon as he was sometimes called, a creature so monstrous that even the gods themselves fled in terror at the first sight of him. Typhoeus was Gaia's final gambit, her last desperate attempt to overthrow the cosmic order that Zeus had established. But this was no ordinary monster. Typhoeus was chaos given form, a being whose very existence was antithetical to the structured universe that the gods had created. He was described as having 100 dragon heads, each one capable of speaking in the voices of different animals, creating a cacophony that could drive mortals insane and make even gods tremble. His size was beyond comprehension, so vast that when he stood, his head brushed against the stars, and when he spread his arms, he could touch the eastern and western horizons simultaneously. His eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 suns, and his breath was a mixture of lava and poisonous gas that could kill anything it touched. From his shoulders sprouted wings that could create hurricanes with their beating, and his lower body was that of a gigantic serpent whose coils could crush mountains. But perhaps most terrifying of all was his purpose. Unlike the Titans who had sought to rule, or the giants who had sought to destroy, Typhoeus sought something far more fundamental. He wanted to return the universe to its primordial state of chaos. He didn't want to be king of the gods. He wanted to ensure that the very concept of kingship became meaningless. When Typhoeus first emerged from the earth, the very act of his rising caused earthquakes that could be felt in every realm. The sea boiled, the sky darkened, and the carefully maintained boundaries between the different levels of reality began to blur. This wasn't just another challenge to Zeus's authority, it was an existential threat to the cosmos itself. The other gods, seeing Typhoeus rise, immediately fled. Even Ares, the god of war, took one look at the monster and transformed himself into a fish to escape. Aphrodite became a dove, Apollo turned into a crow, and Artemis became a cat. One by one, the gods abandoned their divine forms and hid in the shapes of animals, hoping that Typhoeus would not notice them. But Zeus could not flee. As king of the gods, he was bound by his own nature to face this threat, even if it meant his own destruction. Standing alone on Mount Olympus, with his thunderbolt in hand and the weight of the entire cosmos on his shoulders, Zeus prepared to face a monster that embodied everything he had fought to prevent. The battle between Zeus and Typhoeus was unlike any conflict that had come before. This wasn't a war between armies, or even between divine powers. It was a fundamental clash between order and chaos, between the structured universe and the primordial void from which it had emerged. Zeus hurled thunderbolt after thunderbolt, each one capable of destroying mountains, but Typhoeus absorbed them all and kept coming. The monster's 100 heads breathed fire that turned the very air to plasma, creating storms of energy that threatened to tear holes in reality itself. His serpentine body coiled around mountains, crushing them to dust, while his wings created winds that could strip the flesh from bones. For a time, it seemed that Zeus might actually lose. Typhoeus managed to grapple with the king of the gods, and in the struggle, he severed the sinews from Zeus's hands and feet, the very tendons that gave him his divine strength. Crippled and powerless, Zeus was dragged to a cave where Typhoeus planned to keep him as a trophy of his victory over order itself. But Zeus was not alone. Hermes, the messenger god, managed to steal back the severed sinews and restore them to Zeus's body. The moment his strength returned, Zeus erupted from the cave with such force that the entire mountain above it was vaporized. The final confrontation had begun. This time, Zeus fought not just with his thunderbolt, but with the combined power of all the natural forces he commanded. Lightning, wind, earthquake, and fire all became weapons in his arsenal. But it was ultimately not power that won the day. It was wisdom. Zeus realized that Typhoeus' strength came from his connection to the earth, just as the giants had. Instead of trying to destroy the monster, Zeus lifted him up and hurled him into the sky, then brought down upon him the entire weight of Mount Etna. Typhoeus was not killed. Beings of such fundamental power cannot simply be destroyed. Instead, he was imprisoned beneath the mountain, where his struggles would create the volcanic eruptions that mortals would witness for millennia to come. His breathing became the lava that flowed down Etna's slopes. His movements became the earthquakes that shook Sicily, and his rage became the fire that burned eternally in the mountain's heart. The defeat of Typhoeus marked the end of the great challenges to Zeus's authority. Never again would the cosmos face a threat that could potentially unmake the very foundations of reality. But the victory came at a cost. Zeus had learned that his power, however great, was not unlimited, and that even the king of the gods could be brought low by forces that operated outside the rules he had established. With the great threats to cosmic order finally subdued, Zeus faced a different kind of challenge, one that would prove far more complex and enduring than any monster or titan. He needed to establish a dynasty, to create a divine family that would ensure the stability of his rule for all eternity, and that meant marriage. But Zeus's approach to marriage was as complicated as everything else about his reign. His first wife was Metis, the Titaness who had helped him defeat his father. Metis was wisdom incarnate, and their union represented the marriage of power and intelligence that would be necessary to rule the cosmos effectively. But prophecy, that eternal curse of divine dynasties, intervened once again. The fates revealed that Metis would bear Zeus 2 children, first a daughter who would be wise and powerful, and then a son who would be destined to overthrow his father, just as Zeus had overthrown Kronos, and Kronos had overthrown Uranus before him. The cycle of divine patricide seemed destined to continue for all eternity. Zeus's response to this prophecy was swift and brutal. Rather than risk the birth of a son who would challenge his authority, he decided to prevent the birth entirely. Using the same deception that had worked against his father, Zeus convinced Metis to transform herself into a fly, and then swallowed her whole. But divine pregnancy cannot be so easily ended. Within Zeus's own body, Metis continued to exist, and their daughter continued to grow. The child developed not in a womb, but within the very mind of Zeus himself, nourished by pure thought and divine wisdom. When the time came for birth, it was unlike anything the cosmos had ever witnessed. Zeus began to suffer from the most terrible headaches, as if his skull were being split from within. Finally, unable to bear the pain any longer, he commanded Hephaestus to take an axe and split his head open. From the wound that resulted, Athena emerged, fully grown, fully armed, and crying out a war cry that shook the heavens. She had been born directly from Zeus's mind, making her not just his daughter, but a literal extension of his own divine intellect. The birth of Athena solved the immediate problem of the prophecy. She was the wise and powerful daughter foretold, but she was also completely loyal to Zeus, having been born from his own thoughts. But the son who would overthrow him was never born, at least not from Metis. The prophecy remained unfulfilled, creating a perpetual tension that would influence Zeus's actions for millennia to come. With Metis consumed and Athena born, Zeus needed a new wife, one who could serve as queen of the gods and help him establish the divine order he envisioned. His choice fell upon his sister Hera, a decision that would prove to be both politically astute and personally catastrophic. Hera was the goddess of marriage and family, making her the perfect choice for a queen who would need to oversee the domestic aspects of divine rule. She was also powerful in her own right, commanding respect from both gods and mortals. Their union would represent the ultimate divine marriage, the perfect partnership between king and queen that would serve as a model for all future marriages. But Zeus's courtship of Hera was not the romantic tale that mortals might expect. Instead, it was a calculated political alliance, negotiated with all the cold precision of a treaty between rival nations. Hera was initially reluctant to marry her brother, perhaps sensing that Zeus's nature was not suited to the fidelity that marriage required. But Zeus was persistent, and eventually she agreed to the union. Their wedding was a cosmic event, attended by all the gods and witnessed by every living being in the universe. The very earth produced new flowers for the occasion, and the heavens themselves seemed to celebrate. For one brief moment, it appeared that the divine order had achieved perfect harmony. But harmony was not in Zeus's nature. Almost immediately after the wedding, he began to stray. His first affair was with Leto, a Titaness who bore him the twin gods Apollo and Artemis. The birth of these children was complicated by Hera's jealousy. She forbade any land from giving Leto shelter, forcing her to give birth on the floating island of Delos. This established a pattern that would define Zeus's marriage for eternity. Zeus would pursue other women, goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women alike, while Hera would respond with jealousy and vengeance. But her anger was rarely directed at Zeus himself. Instead, she would punish his lovers and their children, creating a cycle of divine drama that would provide material for countless myths and legends. The psychological dynamic between Zeus and Hera was complex and destructive. Zeus's infidelities were not just personal failings. They were expressions of his divine nature as a fertility god, his role as the source of all life in the cosmos. But Hera's jealousy was equally fundamental to her nature as the goddess of marriage. She could not tolerate infidelity, even as she was married to a being whose very essence made fidelity impossible. Their conflicts often played out on a cosmic scale. When Zeus pursued the nymph Io, Hera transformed her into a cow and sent a gadfly to torment her across the known world. When he seduced Europa, Hera sent monsters to pursue her. When he fell in love with Semele, Hera tricked the mortal woman into asking Zeus to appear before her in his true form, knowing that the sight would destroy her. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Zeus's marriage to Hera was what it revealed about the nature of divine power itself. Even the king of the gods could not have everything he wanted. His desire for absolute authority conflicted with his need for companionship and legitimacy. His nature as a fertility god conflicted with his role as a husband. His power to command obedience conflicted with his inability to command love. The marriage of Zeus and Hera became a symbol of the fundamental tensions that exist within any system of absolute power. It showed that even gods must make compromises, that even divine authority comes with costs, and that some conflicts cannot be resolved through force alone. From his union with Hera and his countless affairs, Zeus sired children who would become some of the most important figures in the divine pantheon. But these were not ordinary offspring. They were embodiments of different aspects of Zeus's own power, each one representing a different facet of divine authority. With Hera, Zeus had 3 children who would play crucial roles in the cosmic order. Ares, the god of war, inherited his father's capacity for violence, but lacked his wisdom and restraint. Where Zeus used force as a tool of governance, Ares reveled in conflict for its own sake. He was the brutal, mindless aspect of warfare, necessary for the cosmic order, but dangerous if not properly controlled. Hebe, the goddess of youth, represented the eternal vitality that Zeus needed to maintain his authority. She served as cupbearer to the gods, ensuring that they remained forever young and powerful. Her presence reminded everyone that the divine order was not just powerful, but also perpetually renewed, never growing old or weak. Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, controlled one of the most fundamental aspects of existence, the moment when life enters the world. Through her, Zeus maintained authority over the creation of new life, ensuring that even the most basic biological processes remained under divine control. But it was Zeus's children from his affairs who would prove most significant to the cosmic order. Apollo, born from his union with Leto, became the god of music, prophecy, and the sun. Through Apollo, Zeus extended his authority into the realm of knowledge and foresight. The oracle at Delphi, Apollo's most important shrine, became a crucial tool of divine governance, allowing Zeus to communicate his will to mortals through prophetic pronouncements. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, became the goddess of the hunt and the moon. She represented the wild, untamed aspects of nature that remained outside normal civilization. Through her, Zeus maintained authority over the natural world, ensuring that even the wilderness remained part of the divine order. Athena, born from Zeus's own head, became the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. She was perhaps his most important child, representing the intellectual aspects of his authority. Where Ares embodied the brutal side of conflict, Athena represented warfare as a tool of policy, violence tempered by wisdom and directed toward specific goals. From his affair with Maia, one of the Pleiades, Zeus fathered Hermes, who became the messenger of the gods and the guide between different realms. Hermes was crucial to the functioning of the divine order, serving as the communication system that allowed Zeus to coordinate the activities of gods across different domains. But perhaps Zeus's most significant mortal child was Heracles, born from his affair with the mortal woman Alcmene. Heracles represented the bridge between divine and mortal realms, possessing enough divine strength to aid the gods in their conflicts, while remaining sufficiently mortal to serve as a champion for humanity. His 12 labors were not just heroic achievements, they were tasks that helped maintain the cosmic order, eliminating monsters and threats that could not be handled by purely divine or purely mortal means. Each of Zeus's children served a specific function in the divine hierarchy he had established. They were not just family members, but administrative officials, each one responsible for a different aspect of cosmic governance. This system allowed Zeus to extend his authority into every corner of existence while maintaining ultimate control over the entire structure. But having so many children also created new challenges. Divine offspring inherited not just their father's power, but also his ambition, and some of them occasionally questioned his authority. The tension between Zeus's need for capable subordinates and his fear of potential rivals created a complex dynamic that would influence divine politics for millennia. The most dangerous of these challenges came from Dionysus, Zeus's son, by the mortal Semele. Dionysus represented the chaotic, ecstatic aspects of divine power, the force that could inspire both religious devotion and complete madness. His cult threatened to undermine the ordered worship that Zeus had established, offering instead a direct, personal experience of the divine that bypassed traditional religious authority. Zeus's response to the challenge posed by Dionysus was characteristic of his political wisdom. Rather than trying to suppress his son's cult entirely, he incorporated it into the official pantheon, making Dionysus one of the 12 Olympian gods. This allowed him to maintain control over the chaotic forces that Dionysus represented, while acknowledging their legitimate place in the cosmic order. Through his children, Zeus created a divine government that was both hierarchical and specialized. Each god had their own domain of authority, but all of them ultimately answered to Zeus. This system proved remarkably stable, lasting for millennia, and providing the foundation for the complex mythological traditions that would influence human culture long after the ancient Greek temples had fallen into ruins. Among all the challenges Zeus faced during his reign, none was more personal or more significant than his conflict with Prometheus, the Titan who had sided with the gods during the war against his own kind. This was not a rebellion by an enemy, but a betrayal by an ally, and Zeus's response to it would reveal the true nature of his authority and the lengths he would go to maintain it. Prometheus was different from the other Titans, where they had relied on brute force and ancient privilege. He possessed a gift for foresight and an understanding of the potential that lay dormant in mortal humanity. He had aided Zeus during the Titanomachy, and his intelligence had been crucial to the gods' victory. But that same intelligence would eventually put him at odds with the new king of the gods. The conflict began with a seemingly minor dispute over sacrificial offerings. When gods and mortals gathered to determine how sacrifices should be conducted, Prometheus was chosen to divide a sacrificial bull. But instead of making an honest division, he attempted to trick Zeus. He wrapped the bones in fat, making them appear appetizing, while hiding the actual meat beneath the hide and organs, making it look unappetizing. Zeus, with his divine perception, immediately saw through the deception. But instead of simply correcting it, he chose to accept the bones and fat, establishing a precedent that would govern sacrificial practices for millennia. From that moment forward, mortals would sacrifice only the bones and fat to the gods, keeping the meat for themselves. This might seem like a minor victory for humanity, but Zeus's acceptance of the deception was part of a larger strategy. He had allowed Prometheus to think he had succeeded in order to justify the terrible punishment he was planning. The sacrifice incident became the pretext for a divine wrath that had deeper, more fundamental causes. The real issue was not the sacrifice itself, but what it represented. Prometheus had demonstrated that he was willing to deceive Zeus for the benefit of mortals. This suggested a dangerous precedent, that the gods' authority over humanity was not absolute, that there were those who would advocate for mortal interests even against divine will. Zeus's response was swift and decisive. He withdrew the gift of fire from humanity, plunging them into a primitive existence where they could no longer cook food, work metal, or protect themselves from the cold and darkness. This was not just a punishment. It was a demonstration of divine power, a reminder that everything mortals possessed existed only at the pleasure of the gods. But Prometheus was not deterred. In an act of defiance that would echo through eternity, he climbed Mount Olympus and stole fire from the gods themselves. Some sources say he took it from Zeus's own thunderbolt, others that he stole it from the forge of Hephaestus. Regardless of the specific method, the result was the same. He returned fire to humanity, giving them once again the tool they needed to build civilization. The theft of fire was more than just a crime. It was a fundamental challenge to the cosmic order Zeus had established. Fire was not just a tool, but a symbol of divine power, and by giving it to mortals, Prometheus was essentially arguing that the boundary between divine and mortal was not as absolute as Zeus claimed. Zeus's punishment of Prometheus was designed to be both retribution and warning. He had the Titan chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where each day an eagle would come to devour his liver. Each night, the liver would regenerate, only to be consumed again the following day. This was eternal torture, but it was also a carefully crafted symbol. The eagle was Zeus's own bird, and the liver was believed to be the seat of emotion and desire. The punishment was literally Zeus consuming Prometheus's passions day after day, forever. But the punishment of Prometheus was only the beginning of Zeus's response to the theft of fire. He also created a new form of divine retribution that would affect all of humanity. The first woman, Pandora. She was crafted by Hephaestus at Zeus's command, given beauty by Aphrodite, cunning by Hermes, and curiosity by Athena. She was then sent to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, as a wedding gift. Pandora carried with her a jar, often mistranslated as a box, that contained all the evils that would plague humanity for the rest of time: disease, war, famine, and death. When her curiosity finally overcame her restraint, she opened the jar and released these evils into the world. Only hope remained trapped inside, a cruel reminder that even in their suffering, mortals would continue to believe that things might somehow improve. The creation of Pandora and the release of evils into the world represented Zeus's ultimate response to Prometheus's challenge. The message was clear. Mortals could have fire, but they would pay for it with suffering. They could have the tools of civilization, but they would also have to endure the consequences of divine displeasure. The story of Prometheus became a central myth in Greek culture, but it was also a political statement about the nature of divine authority. Zeus's punishment was not just about maintaining his power, it was about establishing the principle that challenging the gods, even for noble reasons, would result in consequences that extended far beyond the individual challenger. The eagle that tormented Prometheus would eventually be slain by Heracles, and the Titan would be freed from his chains. But the lesson of his punishment remained. Divine authority was not subject to moral judgment by mortals or even by other immortals. Zeus's will was law, and law was whatever Zeus decided it should be. As Zeus's reign continued, he grew increasingly dissatisfied with the mortals who populated the earth. These were not the primitive humans who had existed during the Titanomachy, but a more advanced civilization that had developed complex societies, sophisticated technologies, and perhaps most troubling of all, the audacity to question divine authority. This generation of mortals, known as the Bronze Age race, had become both powerful and corrupt. They had learned to work metal, build cities, and wage war on a scale that rivaled the conflicts of the gods themselves. But with power had come arrogance, and with arrogance had come the kind of hubris that Zeus found intolerable. The final straw came when the mortals began to challenge the gods directly. Some sources suggest they attempted to storm Mount Olympus itself, while others indicate they simply refused to offer proper sacrifices and worship. Whatever the specific transgression, it was clear to Zeus that humanity had forgotten its place in the cosmic order. His solution was characteristically extreme. He would destroy the entire human race and start over with a new creation that would be more properly respectful of divine authority. The method he chose was a flood that would cover the entire earth, drowning every living thing and returning the world to its primordial state. But Zeus was not content to simply rain destruction from the heavens. He enlisted the aid of his brother Poseidon, who commanded the seas to rise and the rivers to overflow their banks. Together, they created a deluge that was not just massive but personal. Every drop of water that fell was infused with divine wrath. Every wave that crashed was an expression of godly displeasure. The flood was total and merciless. Cities were swept away, mountains were submerged, and the carefully constructed civilization of the Bronze Age was obliterated, as if it had never existed. The screams of the drowning were said to be so terrible that even some of the gods felt pity, but Zeus remained unmoved. This was not cruelty but necessity, the cleansing of a world that had become too corrupted to continue. But Zeus had learned from his father's mistakes. Where Kronos had devoured his children out of blind fear, Zeus made sure that his destruction of humanity served a constructive purpose. He preserved two mortals who had remained faithful to the gods, Deucalion, the son of Prometheus, and Pyrrha, the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. These two mortals were warned of the coming flood by Prometheus, who, despite his own punishment, still felt compassion for humanity. They built an ark and stocked it with food and animals, riding out the deluge while the rest of their species perished in the waters below. When the flood finally receded and dry land appeared once more, Deucalion and Pyrrha found themselves alone in a world that had been washed clean of all trace of previous civilization. They made their way to the oracle at Delphi, where they asked the gods how they might restore the human race. The oracle's response was cryptic: "Throw the bones of your mother behind you." After much confusion, they realized that the mother referred to was Gaia, the Earth Mother, and her bones were the stones that lay scattered across the newly revealed landscape. As they walked across the empty earth, casting stones behind them, a miracle occurred. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men, while those thrown by Pyrrha became women. This new human race, born from the very bones of the earth itself, would be fundamentally different from their predecessors. They would be more humble, more respectful of divine authority, and more aware of their place in the cosmic order. The flood myth was not just a story about divine punishment. It was a founding myth for the new age of Zeus's rule. It established the principle that divine authority was absolute, that challenging the gods would result in total destruction, and that even the continuation of the human race depended entirely on divine favor. But the flood also revealed something important about Zeus's character. Unlike his father, who had been driven by paranoid fear, Zeus was motivated by a vision of cosmic order. His destruction of humanity was not an end in itself, but a means to create a better world. He was not just a destroyer, but a creator. Not just a tyrant, but a divine architect, reshaping reality according to his will. The new human race that emerged from the stones would prove to be exactly what Zeus had hoped for. They built temples to honor the gods. They offered proper sacrifices, and they maintained the respectful distance between mortal and divine that the cosmic order required. They were not perfect. No mortal could be. But they understood their limitations and accepted their place in the hierarchy of existence. The flood became a cornerstone of Greek religious thought, a reminder that divine mercy was not a right, but a gift, and that the continuation of civilization itself depended on maintaining proper relationships with the gods. It was a story that would be retold for millennia, influencing religious traditions far beyond the boundaries of ancient Greece. As Zeus's reign matured, he faced a new kind of challenge, one that came not from external enemies, but from the very success of the divine order he had established. The gods had become comfortable in their power, and with comfort came the petty jealousies and rivalries that would ultimately lead to one of the most devastating conflicts in mortal history. The crisis began, as many divine disasters do, with a wedding. Peleus, a mortal hero, was marrying Thetis, a sea nymph, and all the gods were invited to the celebration. All, that is, except for Eris, the goddess of discord. This slight was not accidental. Eris had a gift for turning peaceful gatherings into battlefields, and her presence at any celebration was almost guaranteed to end in conflict. But Eris was not one to accept exclusion quietly. She appeared at the wedding uninvited, carrying with her a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." She tossed the apple among the assembled goddesses and disappeared, leaving behind a prize that would set divine against divine. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each had compelling reasons to consider herself the fairest. Hera was the queen of the gods, possessed of a terrible beauty that reflected her divine authority. Athena was the embodiment of perfect wisdom and strategic thinking, her beauty enhanced by her intelligence and capability. Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty itself, her very existence defined by her ability to inspire desire and admiration. The argument that followed threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed harmony of Olympus. The 3 goddesses appealed to Zeus to judge between them, but Zeus, with the political wisdom that had kept him in power for so long, recognized the trap. Whatever decision he made would earn him the eternal enmity of 2 of the most powerful goddesses in the Pantheon. There was no way to win, so he chose not to play. Instead, Zeus delegated the decision to a mortal. Paris, a prince of Troy who was known for his beauty and his skill as a judge of aesthetic matters. This seemed like a clever solution, removing Zeus from the dispute while ensuring that the judgment would be made by someone with appropriate qualifications. But Paris was not just any mortal. He was the son of Priam, king of Troy, and prophecy had foretold that he would be the cause of his city's destruction. As an infant, he had been abandoned on Mount Ida to die, but he had been rescued and raised by shepherds. Now, as a young man tending flocks on the mountainside, he was about to make a decision that would reshape the ancient world. The three goddesses appeared before Paris in all their divine glory, each one more beautiful than mortal eyes should have been able to bear. But they did not simply present themselves for judgment. Each offered him a bribe that reflected her own particular powers and priorities. Hera, as queen of the gods, offered Paris political power. She would make him ruler of all Asia, command over vast armies, and dominion over nations. This was the offer of earthly authority, the chance to wield the kind of power that mortals could only dream of. Athena offered wisdom and glory in war. She would make him the greatest strategist who ever lived, ensure his victory in every battle, and grant him the kind of fame that would make his name immortal. This was the offer of excellence, the chance to achieve greatness through skill and intelligence. Aphrodite offered something simpler, but perhaps more powerful: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. She would arrange for Paris to marry Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, whose beauty was so renowned that men across the ancient world dreamed of her. Paris, thinking with the short-sightedness that would prove characteristic of his decisions, chose Aphrodite's offer. He awarded her the golden apple, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to the Trojan War, the destruction of Troy, and the death of countless heroes on both sides of the conflict. But from Zeus's perspective, the judgment of Paris represented something far more significant than a simple beauty contest. It was a test of the limits of divine authority and the consequences of delegation. By passing the decision to a mortal, Zeus had hoped to avoid the political fallout of choosing between the three goddesses. Instead, he had created a situation where divine conflicts would be played out on the mortal stage, with mortals paying the price for godly rivalries. The decision also revealed the fundamental tensions within the divine order itself. Despite all of Zeus's efforts to create a stable hierarchy, the gods remained capable of the same petty jealousies and competitive impulses that drove mortal behavior. The difference was that when gods competed, the consequences were felt across the entire world. Helen's abduction by Paris, facilitated by Aphrodite, would lead to the gathering of the greatest heroes of the age. Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, and countless others would sail to Troy to recover her, not just because of her beauty, but because her abduction represented a challenge to the entire system of divine and mortal authority. The Trojan War, which would rage for 10 years and end with the complete destruction of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, was thus the direct result of Zeus's attempt to avoid making a difficult decision. It was a reminder that in the world of the gods, neutrality was often impossible, and that the consequences of divine actions could extend far beyond their intended scope. The Trojan War, born from the vanity of goddesses and the poor judgment of a shepherd prince, became the ultimate test of Zeus's authority over both gods and mortals. This was not just a conflict between two cities, but a canvas upon which the entire Pantheon would paint their rivalries, their loyalties, and their competing visions of justice. From the moment the Greek ships appeared on the horizon of Troy, the gods began choosing sides. Hera and Athena, still bitter over losing the golden apple to Aphrodite, threw their support behind the Greeks. Aphrodite naturally favored the Trojans, as did her lover Ares, who saw in the conflict an opportunity to revel in the warfare he so loved. Apollo, the god of prophecy and music, also sided with Troy, perhaps because he appreciated the cultural sophistication of the city, or perhaps simply because he opposed Athena's faction. Zeus found himself in the impossible position of trying to maintain neutrality while his entire family took sides in the conflict. This was not just a political challenge, but a fundamental test of his authority. Could the king of the gods maintain order in his own household while a war raged below that threatened to consume the entire known world? The situation became even more complex when Zeus's own son, Sarpedon, entered the battle as a leader of the Lycian allies of Troy. Here was a case where Zeus's personal interests as a father conflicted with his responsibilities as the supreme deity. When Sarpedon was killed by Patroclus, Zeus was faced with the temptation to intervene directly, to save his son or at least avenge his death. But it was the rage of Achilles that truly put Zeus's authority to the test. Achilles was the greatest warrior of his age, the son of the sea nymph Thetis and the mortal Peleus. His mother had tried to make him immortal by dipping him in the river Styx, but she had missed the heel by which she held him, leaving him with a single point of vulnerability. More importantly, Achilles had been given a choice by fate. He could live a long, obscure life, or he could die young and achieve eternal glory. He had chosen glory. When Achilles withdrew from the fighting, due to his quarrel with Agamemnon over the captive woman Briseis, the war's balance shifted dramatically. The Trojans, led by Hector, began to push the Greeks back to their ships. This was exactly the kind of situation where Zeus might have been expected to intervene to maintain the balance of power. But Zeus's response was characteristically complex. Instead of directly intervening, he allowed events to unfold according to their own logic. When Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor, was killed by Hector, Zeus permitted the tragedy that would drive Achilles back into the war with a fury that would make him unstoppable. The death of Patroclus transformed Achilles from a sulking warrior into an avatar of divine vengeance. His rage was so pure and terrible that it transcended mere human emotion. It became a force of nature, as inexorable as an earthquake or a tsunami. When he finally faced Hector in single combat, it was not just a fight between two men, but a cosmic event that would determine the fate of Troy. Zeus's decision to allow Hector's death was one of the most controversial of his reign. Hector was not just a great warrior, but a fundamentally good man, a loving husband, a devoted father, and a defender of his city. His death at the hands of Achilles was a tragedy that even the gods found difficult to watch. But Zeus understood that some events were too fundamental to the cosmic order to be prevented, even by divine intervention. The aftermath of Hector's death revealed another aspect of Zeus's character. When Achilles dishonored Hector's body by dragging it behind his chariot, Zeus intervened not to punish the Greek hero, but to restore the balance of honor and dignity that the cosmic order required. He sent Hermes to guide Priam, Hector's father, to Achilles' tent, where the old king's grief would finally touch the warrior's heart and convince him to return his son's body for proper burial. This scene, the enemy king kneeling before the man who had killed his son, asking for the simple dignity of a proper funeral, became one of the most powerful moments in all of ancient literature. It demonstrated Zeus's understanding that true authority requires not just power, but also wisdom, compassion, and respect for the fundamental decencies that make civilization possible. The Trojan War continued for several more years after Hector's death, but its outcome was never really in doubt. Troy was doomed, not because the Greeks were stronger or more deserving, but because the cosmic order required it. The city's destruction was the price of Paris's poor judgment, of divine vanity, and of the fundamental principle that actions have consequences, even when those consequences seem disproportionate to the original offense. When Troy finally fell, burned and sacked by the Greeks, Zeus did not intervene to save the city or its people. This was not cruelty, but cosmic justice, the working out of fate according to principles that transcended individual sympathy or personal preference. The king of the gods had learned that true authority sometimes requires the wisdom to do nothing, to allow events to unfold according to their own inevitable logic. Throughout his reign, Zeus faced a constant challenge that no amount of divine power could completely solve: the tendency of mortals to forget their place in the cosmic order. Success bred arrogance, and arrogance bred the kind of hubris that demanded divine correction. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring patterns that revealed fundamental truths about the relationship between divine and mortal authority. One of the most dramatic examples of this pattern was the story of Niobe, Queen of Thebes, whose pride in her children led to devastating consequences. Niobe had been blessed with 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, all of them healthy, beautiful, and accomplished. In her joy and pride, she made the fatal mistake of comparing her good fortune to that of the gods themselves. During a festival honoring Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, Niobe publicly declared that she was more blessed than the goddess because she had 14 children, while Leto had only 2. This was not just boastfulness, but a fundamental challenge to the divine order. By claiming superiority over a goddess, Niobe was essentially arguing that mortal achievement could surpass divine blessing. The response was swift and merciless. Apollo and Artemis, the twin gods of archery, descended from Olympus with their silver bows. One by one, they struck down Niobe's children with arrows that never missed their mark. The sons fell first, shot down as they practiced their sports and warfare. Then the daughters, killed even as they huddled together in fear. Niobe's punishment was not just the loss of her children, but her transformation into a weeping stone that would forever mourn their deaths. Even as a rock, she would continue to produce tears, serving as an eternal reminder of the price of challenging divine authority. But Zeus's response to mortal hubris was not always so direct. Sometimes he employed more subtle methods, allowing mortals to destroy themselves through their own arrogance. The story of Bellerophon, the hero who tamed the winged horse Pegasus, demonstrated this approach. Bellerophon had achieved great fame by defeating the Chimera, a monster with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. His success had been possible only because he rode Pegasus, a gift from the gods that allowed him to attack the monster from above. But victory made him proud, and pride made him forget the source of his success. Believing that his achievements made him worthy of divine status, Bellerophon attempted to ride Pegasus to Mount Olympus itself. He intended to claim a place among the gods, to be recognized as their equal, based on his heroic deeds. But Zeus had no intention of allowing such presumption to succeed. Instead of striking Bellerophon down directly, Zeus simply sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus. The horse bucked, throwing its rider from the heavens. Bellerophon survived the fall, but was left lame and blind, condemned to wander the earth as a beggar, forever reminded of his folly. The message was clear. Mortals could achieve great things, but only with divine assistance, and that assistance could be withdrawn at any moment. Heroes were not self-made, but God-made, and forgetting this fundamental truth would lead to inevitable downfall. Perhaps the most complex example of Zeus's response to mortal hubris was his treatment of Prometheus's gift of fire to humanity. The theft of fire had given mortals the tools they needed to build civilization, but it had also given them the capacity for the kind of technological pride that could challenge divine authority. Zeus's response was not to take fire away again, that would have been too simple, but to ensure that every advance in human knowledge and capability came with corresponding dangers and responsibilities. The same fire that allowed mortals to forge tools and cook food could also burn down their cities. The same intelligence that allowed them to build ships and navigate the seas could also lead them to wage wars of unprecedented destruction. This principle, that divine gifts always come with divine prices, became a fundamental aspect of Zeus's governance. Mortals could have fire, but they would also have Pandora's evils. They could have heroes, but those heroes would also bring tragedy. They could have civilization, but civilization would also bring the capacity for its own destruction. The pattern repeated throughout Greek mythology like a drumbeat of divine justice. Mortals would rise, achieve greatness, forget their place, and fall. Zeus watched it all from his throne, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with anger, but always with the cold certainty that the cosmic order must be maintained. Take the story of Ixion, the king of the Lapiths, whose crime was not just hubris, but the violation of the most sacred bonds of hospitality and trust. Ixion had murdered his father-in-law, a crime so heinous that no mortal would purify him. Only Zeus, in his mercy, agreed to cleanse Ixion of his blood guilt and welcome him to Olympus as a guest. But Ixion repaid this divine kindness with the ultimate betrayal. He dared to lust after Hera herself, Zeus's queen, believing that his status as a divine guest gave him license to pursue even the wife of the king of the gods. When he attempted to seduce her, Zeus's response was as creative as it was cruel. He fashioned a cloud in Hera's exact likeness and presented it to Ixion, who, blinded by his own desire, made love to what he thought was the queen of the gods. From this union with the cloud was born Centaurus, the father of all centaurs, creatures that would forever embody the wild, uncontrolled nature of mortal passion. But Ixion's punishment was far from over. Zeus bound him to a wheel of fire that would spin eternally through the heavens, a blazing reminder that violated trust and divine hospitality would be repaid with eternal torment. Even now, if you look up at the sky on a clear night, some say you can still see that wheel turning among the stars. The message was unmistakable. Zeus's mercy was real, but it had limits. Cross those limits, and the consequences would be beyond anything mortal imagination could conceive. But Zeus's challenges didn't come only from mortals. The king of the gods ruled over a family that was, to put it mildly, complicated. Olympus was filled with gods and goddesses who had their own agendas, their own ambitions, and their own very personal grievances against their divine patriarch. Consider the rebellion that nearly toppled Zeus from his throne, not from titans or monsters, but from his own wife and children. Hera, still bitter over Zeus's countless infidelities, conspired with Poseidon and Athena to bind the king of the gods while he slept. They succeeded, wrapping him in chains that even his divine strength couldn't break. The conspirators argued among themselves about who should rule in Zeus's place. their voices echoing through the empty halls of Olympus as the bound god listened in growing rage. But they had forgotten about Thetis, the sea nymph who had once been promised to Zeus before a prophecy warned that her son would be greater than his father. Thetis, loyal to Zeus despite being passed over for Hera, summoned Briareus, one of the 100-handed giants who had helped Zeus defeat the Titans. The giant's 100 hands made quick work of the chains, and Zeus was free before his conspirators even realized what had happened. His vengeance was swift and pointed. Hera he suspended from the heavens by golden chains with anvils tied to her feet. Poseidon and Apollo, for Apollo had joined the conspiracy, he sent to serve King Laomedon of Troy, building the walls of that doomed city with their own divine hands. The message was clear. Even gods were not above the law of Zeus's authority. But perhaps the most telling aspect of this story was what happened next. Rather than holding grudges forever, Zeus eventually forgave his rebellious family members. Hera was released. Poseidon and Apollo returned to their divine roles, and life on Olympus continued much as it had before. This was not weakness, but a kind of divine pragmatism. Zeus understood that eternal punishment of his own family would only breed more rebellion. The king of the gods had learned that ruling immortals required a different touch than ruling mortals. Mortals could be crushed, or transformed, or swept away entirely, but gods were eternal. They had to be managed, guided, sometimes punished, but ultimately reconciled. Even divine authority had its limits. Of all the events that would test Zeus's authority and wisdom, none would prove more consequential than a simple wedding invitation, or rather, the lack thereof. When the sea nymph Thetis married the mortal hero Peleus, all the gods were invited to the celebration, except one, Eris, the goddess of strife and discord. Now, leaving Eris uninvited might seem like good planning. Who wants the personification of conflict at their wedding? But divine protocol existed for a reason, and slighting a goddess, even an unpleasant one, was dangerous business. Eris arrived at the wedding uninvited, carrying with her a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." She tossed it among the celebrating gods and watched as 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each was convinced that she alone deserved the title of the fairest, and each was prepared to fight for it. The situation put Zeus in an impossible position. Choosing between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of love was a decision that would anger at least 2 of them permanently. In a move that seemed clever at the time, Zeus decided to pass the responsibility to a mortal, a young shepherd prince named Paris, who tended flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida. What Zeus perhaps didn't fully consider was that Paris was not just any shepherd. He was a prince of Troy, cast out as a baby because of a prophecy that he would one day bring about the destruction of his city. The very man Zeus chose to make this divine judgment was already marked by fate as an agent of catastrophe. Each goddess appeared before Paris, and each offered him a bribe. Hera promised him power over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and glory in battle. But Aphrodite's offer was the most tempting of all, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite, and in that moment the seeds of the Trojan War were sown. Helen might have been the most beautiful woman in the world, but she was also married to King Menelaus of Sparta. Her abduction by Paris would unite all of Greece in a war that would rage for 10 years and end with the complete destruction of Troy. From his throne on Olympus, Zeus watched the consequences of his decision unfold. The war that followed would test not just mortal heroes, but the gods themselves, splitting the divine family into opposing sides and threatening to tear apart the very fabric of the cosmic order. Had Zeus made the right choice in delegating the judgment to a mortal? Or was this another example of the complex web of fate that even the king of the gods could not fully control? The answer would become clear only in the ashes of Troy and the tears of its people. The war that followed Paris's judgment would become the defining conflict of the mythological age, a 10-year siege that would claim the lives of the greatest heroes of both sides and forever change the relationship between gods and mortals. Zeus found himself in the peculiar position of trying to maintain neutrality in a conflict that his own decision had set in motion. Officially, he remained above the fray, but the other gods showed no such restraint. They chose sides based on personal preferences, old grudges, and political alliances, turning the human conflict into a divine civil war. Hera and Athena, still bitter over Paris's slight, supported the Greeks with a vengeance. Aphrodite naturally favored the Trojans, protecting Paris despite his many failings as a warrior. Apollo, god of prophecy and music, also sided with Troy, while his sister Artemis remained largely neutral. Poseidon's sympathies lay with the Greeks, though he occasionally helped the Trojans when Zeus's attention was elsewhere. The result was a war unlike any other, where mortal heroes fought under the direct guidance of immortal patrons. Achilles raged across the battlefield with Athena's blessing, while Hector fought with Apollo's protection. Divine interference became so common that Zeus was forced to issue periodic bans on godly intervention, though these were routinely ignored by his fractious family. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Zeus himself nearly broke his own neutrality. His son Sarpedon, fighting for the Trojans, was destined to die at the hands of Patroclus. Zeus, watching from above, felt the pull of paternal love and considered saving his son despite the demands of fate. It was Hera who reminded him of the consequences. If Zeus saved Sarpedon, every other god would demand the same privilege for their own mortal children. The war would never end, and the very concept of fate would become meaningless. With a heavy heart, Zeus allowed his son to die, though he honored him by sending a rain of blood to mark his passing. This moment revealed a fundamental truth about Zeus's rule. Even the king of the gods was bound by forces greater than his own will. Fate, it seemed, was the one power that even Zeus could not challenge without risking the complete breakdown of cosmic order. The war dragged on for 10 years, a grinding conflict that seemed to have no end. Heroes fell on both sides, and the gods grew weary of the constant intervention and counter-intervention. It was Athena who finally devised the stratagem that would end the siege: the Trojan horse. The great wooden horse, built by the craftsman Epius under Athena's guidance, was a masterpiece of deception. Hidden inside were the greatest Greek warriors, including Odysseus, the architect of the plan. When the Trojans brought the horse inside their walls, thinking it was a gift from the departing Greeks, they sealed their own doom. The sack of Troy was brutal, even by the standards of ancient warfare. The city burned, its men were slaughtered, and its women and children were taken as slaves. King Priam, who had ruled Troy for decades, was killed at the altar of Zeus himself, his blood staining the sacred stone. But the fall of Troy was not just a military victory. It was a divine judgment. The city's destruction had been prophesied from the moment of Paris's birth, and no amount of heroism or divine protection could change that fundamental truth. Troy fell because it had to fall, because the cosmic order demanded it. Yet even in victory, the Greeks would find no lasting peace. Their treatment of the defeated Trojans had been so brutal that it offended the gods themselves. The rape of Cassandra in Athena's temple, the murder of Priam at Zeus's altar, the slaughter of Hector's infant son. These crimes demanded divine retribution. The Greek ships that sailed from Troy's burning harbor would face storms, shipwrecks, and divine curses. Agamemnon would be murdered by his own wife upon his return. Odysseus would wander for 10 years before seeing his home again. The victory that had seemed so complete would prove to be the beginning of new sorrows. Zeus watched it all with the cold satisfaction of justice served. The war had ended as it had to end, with the guilty punished and the cosmic order restored. But the price of that restoration had been the destruction of an entire civilization and the death of a generation of heroes. The Trojan War marked the end of what the Greeks would later call the Age of Heroes. In the aftermath of Troy's fall, something fundamental had changed in the relationship between gods and mortals. The great heroes who had walked with gods and performed impossible deeds were gone, and their like would not be seen again. Zeus himself seemed to step back from direct intervention in mortal affairs. The age of gods appearing to heroes in person, of divine children performing miraculous feats, of mortals ascending to divine status, all of that began to fade like morning mist. The king of the gods had perhaps grown weary of the constant conflicts, the endless need to balance justice with mercy, power with wisdom. But his influence did not disappear entirely. Instead, it became more subtle, more indirect. Zeus's justice now worked through natural law and moral consequences, rather than direct divine intervention. The guilty would still be punished, but through the actions of other mortals, rather than lightning bolts from heaven. The transition was not immediate or complete. There would still be moments when Zeus's presence was felt directly, when oaths were broken, when guests were mistreated, when the cosmic order was threatened. But these interventions became rarer, more carefully considered, more final in their consequences. In some ways, this represented the maturation of Zeus's rule. The young god who had overthrown his father, in a burst of revolutionary violence, had become a wise king who understood that the best governance was often the least visible. Power, he had learned, was most effective when it was felt rather than seen. But even Zeus, king of the gods, was not immune to the power of fate. There existed a prophecy, whispered in the darkest corners of the underworld, that spoke of his eventual downfall. Just as Zeus had overthrown Kronos, and Kronos had overthrown Uranus, so too would Zeus face a challenger from his own bloodline. The prophecy was specific. Zeus would father a son who would be greater than himself, and this son would bring about the end of his reign. This knowledge haunted Zeus throughout his rule, influencing his decisions in ways both subtle and profound. It was why he had swallowed Metis, his first wife, when she was pregnant with Athena. The prophecy had warned that Metis would bear first a daughter, then a son who would overthrow Zeus. By consuming her, Zeus had prevented the birth of his potential usurper, though Athena had eventually emerged from his head, fully grown and armored. It was also why Zeus had arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal rather than taking her as his own wife. The sea nymph had been promised to him, but when the same prophecy was spoken about her offspring, Zeus hastily arranged her marriage to the hero Peleus. Their son would indeed be greater than his father, but as a mortal, Achilles posed no threat to Zeus's divine throne. But prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves in unexpected ways. By trying to prevent his downfall, Zeus might have been setting in motion the very events that would bring it about. The web of fate was complex, and even the king of the gods could not see all its threads. As the ages passed and the world changed around him, Zeus remained on his throne, eternal and watchful. Mount Olympus stood unchanged, while mortal civilizations rose and fell in the world below. The gods continued their eternal dramas, their loves and rivalries and schemes, but with less direct impact on mortal affairs. Zeus had become something more than a king. He was the guardian of cosmic order itself. His thunderbolts still split the sky when justice demanded it. His eagles still soared over the earth as his messengers. His presence was still felt in every oath sworn, every guest welcomed, every ruler who sought to govern justly. But he was also, in his way, a prisoner of his own success. The cosmic order he had established was so complete, so perfectly balanced, that it now ran almost without his direct intervention. He was like a master craftsman who had built a machine so perfect that it no longer needed his constant attention. This was perhaps the ultimate irony of Zeus's rule. In achieving perfect authority, he had made himself, in some sense, unnecessary. The laws he had established were now natural laws. The justice he dispensed was now moral law. The order he maintained was now cosmic law. Yet still he watched. Still he waited. Still he prepared for the day when the prophecy might come to pass and his reign would face its ultimate test. For Zeus knew, as all great rulers must know, that power is not a possession to be held, but a responsibility to be discharged, not a treasure to be hoarded, but a burden to be carried. The king of the gods sat on his throne, eternal and alone, bearing the weight of the world's order on his shoulders. And in that loneliness, perhaps, lay the true cost of divine authority, to be responsible for everything, answerable to none, and forever vigilant against the forces that would tear apart the cosmos itself. In the end, Zeus's story is not one of simple tyranny or benevolent kingship, but of the eternal struggle to maintain order in a universe that tends toward chaos. He was neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but something more complex, a force of nature given consciousness and will, a power that shaped the world through choices that mere mortals could never fully comprehend. His legacy lived on in every storm that crossed the sky, every judgment rendered in the name of justice, every moment when the powerful were reminded that there are limits to mortal authority. Zeus had become more than a god. He had become a principle, an idea, a promise that the universe itself was governed by laws that even kings and emperors could not break. The ancient Greeks who first told these stories understood something that we sometimes forget: that power without wisdom is destruction, that authority without justice is tyranny, and that even the gods themselves must answer to something greater than their own desires. Zeus's story was their way of wrestling with these eternal truths, of trying to understand how the world could be both chaotic and ordered, both terrible and beautiful, both just and cruel. And perhaps that is why Zeus endures, why his story continues to resonate across the centuries. In a world that often seems random and unfair, there is comfort in the idea that someone, even a flawed, complicated, sometimes terrible someone, is watching over the cosmic order, ensuring that justice will eventually prevail and that the guilty will face consequences for their actions. The thunder still rolls across the sky, the lightning still splits the darkness, and somewhere, in the space between myth and reality, the king of the gods continues his eternal vigil, bearing the weight of the world's order on his shoulders, forever watching, forever judging, forever reminding us that there are powers in this universe greater than any mortal ambition. And so our tale comes to an end, as all tales must. We've walked through the halls of Olympus, witnessed the rise and fall of heroes, and seen the cosmic order maintained through millennia of divine rule. Zeus remains on his throne, eternal and watchful, the Thunder King whose story echoes through every storm that crosses the sky. The fire is burning low now, and the night is deep. But somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the rumble of thunder, the reminder that the old powers are still there, still watching, still ensuring that the world maintains its precarious balance between order and chaos. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the myths and legends of the ancient world. If you've enjoyed this tale, please like and subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told, many more mysteries to explore in the shadows of forgotten ages. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of the ancient world. The story of Zeus continues, as it always has, in every flash of lightning and roll of thunder that reminds us that some powers are eternal, some stories never truly end, and some truths are too great for any single tale to contain.